Welcome back. So, we got a new Fate channel. I don't think any of us were really expecting any sort of Fate channel. I think we were just expecting a regular banner trailer. But to a lot of everyone's surprise, we got a Fate channel, and they introduced not only a 3 Hopes banner, which I'll discuss in a future video, but they came out with this brand new gimmick on Arcane Heroes, where now you can just inherit PRFs, because that's a thing now. It's kind of crazy to think about that we've just been increasing the amount of power creep inheritable swords to the point where now we have this amalgamation on everyone. And I figured because this is a brand new gimmick sort of inheritable PRF thing, that a video going over probably the best users and some of the users that definitely do not want this is the good approach going forward, because I know there's a lot of people looking to put this on a lot of their favorites, but I want to at least give some guidance before people start polling for this, which is why I have this video coming out a day before the banner releases. As such, I'm pretty much here just to give an overview, a basic guide to the weapon itself, good users, bad users, all that jazz. So we may as well just get right into it. Before we just go right into like the best users of it, or going through like each category of like slow and fast units in particular, let's just summarize the weapon real quick. It's a slaying edge that not only grants a guaranteed follow-up, but it prevents follow-up attacks. It inflicts -6 attack and defense on the foe during combat, and guard. So, a weird side grade Maltet in some aspects? It's weird. All in all though, it's a really, really good weapon, not only due to the fact that it's a slaying edge, but also it can benefit so many types of units, even units with PRFs that would much rather run this. It's also worth noting 2 things. You don't lose Lif if you give somebody his weapon. You can keep him. It's really, really cool. The other thing is that if you were to give this weapon to anybody with a PRF skill, then they can't use it at the same time as this weapon. So if you were to give this, for example, to Legendary Sigurd, who I highly advise not to, then he can't use Holy Knight Aura or his Crusader's Ward. And assuming this also is inheritable to every single sword, I can't imagine it wouldn't be. I'm going to be going over every single archetype and basically who would benefit the most, who would benefit the least, yada yada yada, and basic general idea builds that you could pretty much implement on a lot of units. So starting us off, we have the slow armors, and in my opinion, these are probably some of the best users of this currently because it pairs super, super well with Hardy Fighter. As not only does it shut off any sort of guaranteed follow-up attack, so it's like effectively a defensive no follow-up, meaning that they can't double through you unless they have some sort of no follow-up effect, akin to the likes of Brave Hector, but also because of the slaying effect, you can consistently loop stuff like Aegis and all that jazz. It's really, really cool. So for the slow armors in particular, I have both Zephios here, basically just showing 2 types of far save builds, but I'll be going into the fast saves relatively quick because there really isn't much to say. You're basically doing the same thing you would on a Brave Hector far save build, but now on Zephio. And Zephio is one of the best benefactors when it comes to this skill because of the fact that it just gives him everything he needs to function, and it's really, really convenient. And it's just weird seeing how one inheritable weapon could make him one of the more desirable sword armors in the Grail pool. But regardless, it's really, really nice to see because now we have more options available. Of course, outside of your slow armors, you could actually put this on a fair amount of fast armors too. So if you wanted to put this on maybe a Winter Manuela, Drog, or Valentine's Ike, you will have to replace Radiant Aether. But outside of that, it's not really that big of an opportunity cost. And it does work for a multitude of builds actually. So if you were to just use your common near save build with Hardy Fighter and Pavis, then you could just run Close Defense 4 and remove any sort of visible buffs the foe may have. It already has guard built into it, so you don't need to run a stance skill. It's a bit redundant at that point, so stacking up any sort of skill that would allow her to basically meet checks a lot easier is a lot better in that regard. But of course, you can also run Unity skills with Savvy Fighter, and this is also especially important because of the fact that you're basically shutting down any sort of guaranteed follow-up akin to the likes of Hardy Fighter, but you're also securing your own doubles with this. So the only way they'd be able to shut it off is with no follow-up, which is really, really good. That on top of the fact that you're also getting damage reduction out of it, it's a really nice combo. And beyond that, I figured it'd be interesting to put something other than a near save or far save build. So what better build than a Gale Force build with Assault Troop? The only caveat here is that you need some external charge because with the weapon in mind, you only have 4 cooldown Gale Force. So you can either run Bold Fighter just for the extra charges, which isn't the worst idea, especially if you are looking just to bypass wary effects, because it does stack. Or you can run Daring Fighter to basically just secure your own doubles, which is akin to the likes of Divine Tier with no follow-up. But in any case, Bold Fighter is definitely way more secure for getting Gale Force off, but Daring Fighter is a lot more consistent in just getting doubles. So if you are going to use Daring Fighter, make sure you have some sort of accelerated cooldown. And we've just been talking about like really good armor candidates with this skill. Let's talk about some units that definitely would not want this. So for example, Arden definitely does not want to replace his weapon for the new Arcane weapon, mainly because Arden's Blade is a dual-phase Brave weapon that easily allows him to get good amounts of damage output very consistently, and can allow him to quad in both phases depending on like the foe, but usually he will be able to get out a fair amount of damage because Ignis with Steady Breath hits really hard before the foe can even get a second attack out, which is partially why I don't think this new weapon would actually benefit him at all, and you're better off just saving it for somebody else that would much rather use it. The same can be said about Black Knight, because as I mentioned, you have to replace Black Luna if you are going to use this weapon, and in my opinion, the only reason Black Knight is really only as relevant as he possibly can be is because of Black Luna. Without it, he's basically just a Grail Winter Manuela, and I don't find that to be as compelling. You can replace it, obviously, and still give him like a Hardy Fighter set and do all that stuff, but I find that the reason Black Knight is way more coveted than a lot of other sword armors that we have is because of Black Luna and how ridiculous of a special that still is. But even with that being the case, there aren't a lot of sword armors that want this skill, and the ones that do, it's pretty obvious because they either have a really bad PRF or no PRF at all. I should have put Summer Edelgard in this graphic too, because I'm going to be going over all the units that probably don't want this weapon, at least notably. So it may be a bit inconsistent in that regard, but I think anyone looking at Summer Edelgard is probably going to be like, yeah, I don't think I want to replace that PRF. So I think that's more self-explanatory there. Next, we get to the slow infantry though, who also really benefit from this. You already could do the same thing akin to the likes of Coral Sabers, so this is trekking old ground to an extent. However, because now it has slaying, it's a lot more coveted in what it's trying to accomplish. So one of the best users easily for the infantry slow category is going to be Skahawk, because not only does he have a really well distributed stat line, but because he can just instantly retaliate with moonbows and heal back with the likes of Bulwark and Mystic Boost after combat, and act as a really competent melee specialist. That's really nice there. Of course, you could also make a Gale Force set akin to the likes of Divine Tearfang and Coral Saber, but because it has slaying in it, you can actually run Time's Pulse with it, and you don't have to run Heavy Blade, which is really convenient. Although you may want some sort of tempo effect if we ever get attack defense tempo in the future, this will at least allow it so you can secure Gale Force procs. But with the likes of no follow-up and attack and defense ideal and all that jazz, you're basically stacking up a lot of bulk and attack to the point where you're just going to be hitting really hard, and you're going to be tanking really easily. And then outside of that, you could also give this to Alphonse, because Alphonse is a rotating bonus consistently both in Aether Raids, Arena, wherever the case may be. So if you had to make those runs a bit easier, this would actually do it quite well, because this weapon actually works really well with him. You can still give him attack defense unity, no follow-up, so he can always secure his own doubles from the weapon, as well as prevent any sort of guaranteed follow-up with units that may have decent speed to the point where they can still bypass the follow-up prevention. And then you can just continue to stack up attack and defense, and he'll end up being a really solid physical tank. However, in my opinion, the fast infantry are the ones that have a lot of cool options going for them, because they have a lot more skills to work with. So for example, if you were to give this to a Galzus, this could really be any generic fast sortie. These are just build examples. But if you were to give this to like Galzus, for example, and stack up attack speed ideal in the Windsweep, Windsweep would cancel out the guaranteed follow-up, and it would become a speed check. And if you were able to have 5 more speed over the foe, which will be really easy for him to do, then he's basically getting doubles with Fire Sweep, which is really cool. And then with the likes of Even Tempest and Flashing Blade, he'll be able to proc Gale Force on his second hit, provided that there aren't any guard effects present, and then he can run away with Even Tempest movement, depending on the turn. And that's really cool. Another thing I noticed is that you can actually triple stack effects with the likes of Vital Astra and Null Sea Disrupt, mainly because the weapon does grant a guaranteed follow-up, so he doesn't necessarily have to run no follow-up, because he does have the speed to work against wary or impact effects, which is really convenient. So if you were to use this with Vital Astra, Null Sea Disrupt, and Time's Pulse, he can have damage reduction, a guaranteed follow-up, and can counterattack regardless of any sort of effects on the field, that's going to be really, really cool. And then with Mystic Boost, he can just keep his sustainability relatively high, which is really convenient. Outside of that, you can still use it with godlike reflexes, run shield pulse. You can still run external support like a Valoria and have it charged up that way and then run any sort of other B slot. But because it has slaying, you can actually have godlike reflexes right out of the gate, which is really, really convenient. And then with Ninja Z-Heart, I found this build to be a bit interesting, and you can actually put this on a lot of units. Because it's effectively a 22 might weapon with slaying and a guaranteed follow-up and all that jazz, you can basically run a Special Spiral AoE set, which is really, really cool. I always found these to be a bit better on mages because most units don't tend to have high res. But if you were to put this on any sort of high attack unit, I'm sure it will do wonders regardless. But in any case, I figured it'd be worth pointing out regardless. Now, in terms of infantry that don't want it, there's going to be a lot because the sword infantry pool is extremely bloated. Like, we're talking really, really bloated. So, recent refines like Rutger absolutely do not want this, mainly because he already has slaying, damage reduction, and speed-based breath on both phases, which is really, really good. So if you were to just run no follow-up, he's going to be performing a lot better with Wanderer Blade than he would with the new arcane weapon, which is why I don't think it'd be worth swapping out. You could potentially swap it out with the likes of Soleil, but I find that her Fire Sweep Gale Force niche is a lot more coveted for the role she finds herself in, especially since it grants unconditional accelerated cooldown per her own attack. So if you are looking for a decent Gale Force unit and you want to use Soleil, then you may as well just keep her weapon. However, if you did want to go into like a mixed phase sort of thing with Soleil, then you could always replace it. But in terms of just Gale Force usage, I find that Soleil Shine is just a lot better. And in any sort of null follow-up unit, would much rather keep no follow-up because the weapon itself could always be shut down by the no follow-up effect in some sort of like sturdy impact effect or whatever the case may be. So running no follow-up with a unit that already has high speed means that they don't have to worry about making any sort of guaranteed follow-up attack, preventing any sort of guaranteed follow-up attack, because they're just going to be able to double regardless, and they're going to be able to prevent any sort of double from the foe anyway. So I find that any sort of no follow-up PRF is worth keeping in that regard. You also have Fallen Merida, who just recently got a refine, I think about 2-3 months ago. It's really, really good. Again, similar to the likes of Soleil, you could use it for Gale Force or any sort of really good hit and run strategy for getting specials out. It also has slaying with the Forsetti effect, but it also just hits a lot harder. And given that she already comes with no follow-up in Flashing Blade, you may as well just keep her weapon. Although, again, you can switch it out. Beyond that, though, you have Genesis Falchion, which not only has Vantage and no follow-up, but it also has Slaying and Dragon Effectiveness, and it has a lot of good stuff going for it. Same thing can really be said about Sharp War Sword. It has Slaying with no follow-up and damage reduction, so there's literally no reason to replace this PRF in particular because it's just way better than the Inheritable. And again, you can still go back to the likes of the no follow-up blade. It does require the foe to have 75% HP or more, so if there are instances where you can't kill and you're using Wind Sweep, then it's not going to work. But even with that being the case, I find that if you have a no follow-up weapon, then you're just better off keeping that than any sort of guaranteed follow-up weapon, especially if you have the speed to make it work. And then you have Laszlo, who has a dual-phase Brave weapon, and in my opinion, attacking twice before the foe can attack once, especially depending on the build, is going to be a lot better than just having a guaranteed follow-up with Slaying, especially since his damage output is going to be a lot better with his PRF in tow. And Ascended Merida also follows the same pattern as Ryoma and Carla. She has no follow-up, Slaying. She has After Combat Times Pulse, which can be really, really good for looping Vital Astra, which a lot of other units really can't do at the moment because we don't have skills akin to it. So keep Ascending Blade. And outside of that, you may as well keep Lioness Blade and Sturdy War Sword. Sturdy War Sword also follows the same patterns as all these other swords, mainly because it has no follow-up, damage reduction, and some other cool stuff. But also, it pairs really, really well with Radiant Aether, and you would have to replace it if you were to run the new arcane weapon. And Flavia isn't really talked about much, and I understand why, because she is a 2-move infantry, but she does have null damage reduction on specials, which is really, really, really strong, especially against units that have any sort of damage reduction properties that she can't pierce through. So in that regard, I wouldn't really replace her weapon either, especially for the people who really, really like Flavia. And then before I forget, I also have to mention Winter Altina and Byleth, both Byleths, obviously, because they both have the same weapon. But Ragnar Elondite also follows the same patterns as Laszlo's Blade. It's dual phase Brave, but with distant counter, so she could also take advantage of future A skills that will come out. So that's going to be really, really nice. And Creator Sword is just a slaying, no follow-up tempo weapon, which is just arguably better than whatever the arcane weapon is, even if it doesn't have stats at the moment, because it is due for a refine. I find that Creator Sword is just going to be a lot more beneficial in the long run, even if it doesn't have stats to it. But in any case, that's pretty much it in terms of the infantry. They have a lot more build variety, but that's also due to the fact that they just have a lot more passives at their disposal. So that makes sense. But in any case, we may as well just go to the slow cavalry next, who can actually use this really, really well too. Most of these units can pretty much use this well if they don't have a PRF, to be honest. But if we were to go to someone like Bertram, Conrad, or even legendary Seliph, you would have to replace Holy War's End, but that's perfectly fine because he's not really that great with it at the moment. But even with that being the case, it has slaying, guaranteed follow-up denial, all that jazz. With guard, it's really, really good. So you don't want to run stuff like flow guard because it does have overlap, but even with that being the case, you can still run a flow if you want to secure it in the player phase. But for the likes of Bertram and Conrad, for example, you could give them Ignis with Heavy Blade and stack up attack and defense as much as possible and run a Trace so they can run out afterward and just secure a lot of damage output. And because it does have slaying, if Bertram is able to make a Heavy Blade check, then Ignis is going to hit really, really hard. Of course, if you want to prioritize your sustainability a lot more, you can still run Sturdy Surge with Panic Smoke, and then Catch, which basically you're stacking up more attack and defense, but trading out the ability to trigger higher cooldown specials. But given that he only has 59 attack at max investment, it's probably going to be a bit more difficult for him. But if you were to find the right cavalry unit, like even Legendary Seliph, which we'll go into in a second, then I can easily see it working out. But also akin to the infantry, you can still make a Gale Force set. They will have to run Heavy Blade because they don't have access to Flashing Blade, but I guess in Seliph's case, it doesn't really matter because 25 speed at max investment isn't good anyway. But regardless, if you were to give something like Flow Force with Attack Smoke and Attack Defense Catch, then he could easily secure Heavy Blade checks, which will be really, really convenient. A lot of these skills may seem like it has a lot of overlap because, you know, Attack Smoke 4 prevents guaranteed follow-ups or follow-ups in general, so that goes against the arcane weapon, and Flow Force basically neutralizes any sort of penalties to attack and speed, but he doesn't use speed. But here's my logic here. As far as my understanding goes, follow-up denial stuff does stack. So if you remember back in like 2017, 2018, where people used to run double quick riposte Hector, my logic here is that the same thing follows suit. So if he were to run double denial follow-ups, then any sort of unit with a guaranteed follow-up and a lot more speed will still not be able to double up without a flow or no follow-up effect, which is really, really interesting, but it also helps with Heavy Blade checks in general because it does debuff attack, which is really nice. And in Flow Force, while it doesn't take speed into account, because his speed isn't really that high, it will make it so if you were to buff his visible attack, then he doesn't have to worry about Heavy Blade checks as much because there's no means of debuffing it or having it panicked because it just neutralizes the effect, which is really, really nice. Outside of that, though, you could always give this to fast cavalry, and to be honest, there really aren't as many unique build options as I would have liked, because Cavs don't really have much outside of like flows and trace, so whatever was already covered could already still be applied to the fast cavalry. But even then, you can still run Wind Sweep or Water Sweep depending on the unit, and basically just make speed checks to double through the follow-up prevention, which is really, really convenient. Especially if you are looking to do some sort of Fire Sweep-esque approach with a Gale Force set in mind, which can actually work out in their favor. But of course, we also have a bunch of cats who absolutely do not want this skill. So Brave Roy, while it can be considered a side grade, I find that Blazing Durandal already does enough on its own to where you probably don't want to waste it on him because the differences in performance probably isn't going to be that substantial. As such, you may as well just keep Blazing Durandal, especially since it's going to be a lot easier to charge specials that way because it does have Special Fighter in it, which is really convenient. You also have the recently released Brave Seliph who has Holy Tide Tearfing, and that weapon is just really, really, really good because it has the built-in Miracle with all sorts of other effects that just makes him hit really, really hard. But also, he would have to give up Air to Light, which grants him extra movement and no follow-up. So, in my opinion, you're better off just keeping what he already has. And the same thing can be applied to Legendary Sigurd. And while his combat isn't exactly the greatest, the reason he's like super coveted is because of his Holy Knight Aura special, which can grant additional movement to all allies if it procs, even if he dies, which is why I don't think it's worth giving it to him either. I also don't think you should give it to Legendary Nana, Reagan, or Sword Reinhardt. Legendary Nana has her basically null damage reduction shtick, which is really, really strong. Of course, you can still give her Ninja Katana if the goal is to pair it up with her PRF beat and just output a significant amount of damage. But Lance Sword is a really, really strong PRF, which I highly do not recommend swapping out for anything, unless it's, again, like Ninja Katana. But that's a bit more gimmicky. And you also have Reagan's weapon, which has built-in Canto 3. And to be honest, the only reason I would want to keep this is more so for supportive capabilities, which may sound dumb, but because it does have Canto 3 on the first 4 turns, she can effectively go in, break anything, or even attack and then run away, which can help your allies out a significant amount, especially if you are looking to position them in a way where they can just go in the following turn or that same turn. And in akin to the likes of Winter Altina and Laszlo, he has a dual phase Brave weapon, so Sword Reinhardt does not want to replace it. Even if you were only able to get 2 attacks out regardless with whichever weapon you chose, I find that the Brave effect on both phases is much, much stronger. And then there's also Dark Mistletoe on Eldigan and Ares. You can make the case for them, because they can still do all sorts of stuff and they wouldn't be relying on one-shot builds with Dark Mistletoe. But I find that their niche is a bit more unique in that regard, which is why I don't think replacing Dark Mistletoe is the right approach, but you can still do it anyway. And they would probably benefit a good amount. I just figured it'd be worth mentioning anyway. And then we also have Storm Sieglin on Legendary Erica, and you really don't want to get rid of this because not only would you be giving up Luna Brace 2, which has the true damage, and the Canto 2, and the Null Guard, I believe, unless that was built into the weapon, but you're also losing out on damage reduction, which she has everything in her kit as is, which is why I don't think it's worth getting rid of anything from her. But that's about it in terms of Cavalry. You just don't want to give this weapon to. And then, of course, last but not least, we have the Fliers, who actually have a bit more to work with, surprisingly, because they have access to the likes of flight skills and dive bomb and all that stuff. So, for example, if you were to give this to the Slow Flyers, New Year Hrid and Ashnard are perfect examples of this because they're relatively min-max and their combat is really bad currently outside of like Coral Saber, but now we have this. So, that's outdated. Anyway, if you were to give them dive bomb with Heavy Blade and a Rain with Catch, he can actually secure Heavy Blade checks a bit easier than probably the Cavalry can because Rain does debuff attack during combat, meaning that Heavy Blade checks are going to be 4 points easier comparatively, which is really, really convenient. Of course, you can also try and run like Joint Drive Attack, but given that you're using Cavalry and you're trying to extend their movement, it's going to be a lot more difficult in that regard. But of course, you can still do the same thing as all the other Cavs and just run Trace, Bonfire, and just stack up attack and defense as much as possible, and then run away a bit afterward. They don't have as much movement, unfortunately, so you could always give them a Tempest, but they can still replicate the same build. It's just that they'll be hitting a lot harder, and they'll be tanking a bit more, because Rain does activate quite consistently. But of course, you could also give this to the Fast Flyers. The only ones that really stuck out were Thief, Rickard, and Tanith, but these were the ones that like I saw in particular that were like generic, so I figured I'd point these out. For Rickard's build, it may seem a bit gimmicky, but he does actually have one of the higher defense stats and speed stat combined totals, so it could potentially work out if you were to buff it in some aspects. So if you were to refine the weapon for defense, which you can, by the way, then it could potentially work out. But in any case, you could still run stuff like Search Sparrow with Catch and Rain, and basically output and tank a fair amount of damage while also being able to secure your own follow-ups, which is really convenient. And as I mentioned earlier, you could still run the other typical Gale Force sets that you were running on the Cavalry, but on the Flyers. But similarly, the issue will be Heavy Blade checks, because it probably will be a bit more difficult. But if you were able to get the Gale Force trigger off, then you can run away with Odd Tempest movement after you use Trace, by the way. So you can enter a second combat and then run away with up to 3 to 4 movement, depending on how far you extend after the first combat, which is really, really convenient. And outside of that, there really aren't that many other Flyers you would want to give this to. So Mirabilis, Valentian Pala, Legendary Rioma, easily do not want to give this to Mirabilis because you are giving up on her Whimsical Dream. As such, I do think keeping Flower Vase, especially since it's a lot more supportive in nature, is going to benefit her a lot better for the role she finds herself in. But if you do want to do like a funny combat thing, you can. It's just that I wouldn't really recommend it. And Valentian Pala also has her dual phase Brave effect, so Reinhardt, Laszlo, Winter Altina, even regular Altina, which we'll get into in a second, you want to keep it. You just want to keep it. The Arcane weapon is just not better than any dual phase Brave weapon. And then similarly with Ryoma, he has no follow-up in his weapon, but you would also be giving up his Bushido 2, which not only has IOs, but damage reduction built into it, meaning that his tanking capabilities just dive bombs comparatively. So I would easily just keep Raijinto, especially since you can run Bushido 2 with it. Beyond that, you have Amidi and Neo, respectively. Amidi you can replace, but I find that having a 15 might player phase Brave Sword is still pretty cool in its own aspects, especially since we don't really have a lot of generic weaponry for swords in particular that hit as hard as Amidi. Granted, it is only 15 might, but considering you can also pair it up with the likes of Dive Bomb and all that jazz, I find that you're just better off keeping it, especially since you can potentially get out 4 attacks at once, which is really nice. And then similarly with all the other no follow-up blades, it has no follow-up in it. There's no reason to replace it, because no follow-up with a good speed set is always going to be better than any sort of guaranteed follow-up with denial follow-ups and all the other defensive properties it comes with. Because if you can just outspeed, then you're not going to be victim to any sort of no follow-up effects, which is why I do think keeping this weapon is going to be a lot better. And then, of course, you have Altina and Young Shida. Altina also follows the same trend as all the other dual-phase Brave units, but she also has Twin Blades, which age remarkably well nowadays, which is why I do think you're better off keeping that too, because otherwise her damage output just significantly dive bombs too, and at that point she's basically just a worse Ashnard in my opinion, which is why you want to just keep Ragnar Longnight with Twin Blades. And then with Feather Sword, while Young Shida definitely fell out of the spotlight as of like late, her weapon still is really good, especially for a melee specialist role. If you are to use her as a vantage tank, you can basically stack up speed and aim for one-shots against all sorts of swords, lances, axes, you name it. It would be really good in that regard. And to be honest, she would still follow the same route as Tanith and Thief Rickard if she were just to get rid of Feather Sword, which is why I don't think it's worth getting rid of. But outside that, these are all the units I would just highly recommend keeping their PRFs for, because I find that their PRFs are just a lot better than the current inheritable weapon. But if you are looking to use specific builds for specific units, then you could basically get a general idea based on all the other armors and infantry and cavalry and flyers. And hopefully this gives you an idea of what you want to do with the sword, because this is basically the flashy new toy, and it is compelling to give this to like any sort of your favorite unit, and you can still do that. I don't want to discourage you from doing whatever you want with it, but if you do want to optimize it for specific units, these are units I would probably put it on. Whatever units I didn't put in not worth it, most of them could always just replace their PRF with this weapon. Again, I didn't really cover the armors as much because there really aren't that many, and the only one that I really left out was Samurai Edelgard, and let's be real, you don't want to get rid of that. But if you are looking for general ideas of what you want to do with this weapon and the builds you want to put for it, I hope this can help guide you in some direction. But anyway, that's all I really got for this video. Let me know what you think down below. Are you really excited for this inheritable weapon? Are you scared what they're going to do in the future for future inheritable weapons? Just let me know what your thoughts are down below. And until next time, I'll see you later.